think blonde hair and blue eyes are purely European traits that evolved together, ancient DNA tells a different story, revealing a complex genetic mashup that completely rewrites the continent's history. There is an image that has defined how people think about European ancestry for a very long time. Fair skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, a combination so strongly associated with Northern Europe that it has been treated, in popular culture and in older scientific literature alike, as a single ancient package. Something that emerged together, traveled together, and settled into Scandinavia and the Baltic as a unified inheritance from deep prehistory. That picture is wrong, not slightly off. Structurally wrong in a way that only became clear once researchers could extract genetic material from bones tens of thousands of years old and read what was actually written inside them. Blue eyes and blonde hair did not evolve together. They did not arrive in Europe together. They were carried by entirely different ancient populations, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, and the combination most people associate with Northern Europe today only emerged when those populations finally met. The story of how that meeting happened is not the story most people have been told. It involves a mutation older than agriculture, a teenage girl buried in Siberia 17,000 years ago, and a collision of worlds in the forests of ancient Scandinavia that nobody alive at the time could have understood the significance of. Ancient DNA made it possible to reconstruct that story. What it revealed was more complicated and more interesting than anything the older models had produced. The first thing to understand about blue eyes is that they are not a color. There is no blue pigment in a blue iris. What you are seeing when you look at a blue-eyed person is the result of an absence, a reduction in melanin so significant that light scatters differently through the tissue of the eye, producing the visual impression of blue, the same way the atmosphere produces the impression of a blue sky. The trait is defined by what is missing, not by what is there. That absence traces back to a single mutation. The gene involved is called OCA2, and it plays a central role in melanin production. Adjacent to it sits a regulatory gene called HERK2, and it is a specific mutation in HERK2 that acts as a switch, dialing down the activity of OCA2 and reducing melanin output in the iris. Every blue-eyed person on Earth carries a version of this same switch. The genetic evidence suggests they all inherited it from a common ancestor. For years, the origin story attached to that mutation came from a 2008 study out of the University of Copenhagen. The researchers identified the HERK2 mechanism correctly. Where they went wrong was the timeline. Their estimate placed the mutation somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago in the region around the Black Sea. That figure entered popular science writing and stayed there long after the research had moved on. It was wrong by a significant margin. A 2016 study examining the genetic history of Ice Age Europe found the same HERK2 mutation in individuals who lived 14,000 years ago in the Caucasus and in Italy. A 2020 study pushed the estimate further still, suggesting blue eyes may have first appeared around 42,000 years ago, roughly coinciding with the arrival of modern humans in Europe. The mutation is not a recent development. It is possibly one of the earliest physical changes that distinguished European populations from their ancestors elsewhere. What this means is that blue eyes have been present in Europe for an extraordinarily long time. Long before farming. Long before the Bronze Age migrations that reshaped the continent. Long before anything that most people would recognize as European civilization. The switch was thrown very early, but the combination most people associate with it was still a very long way off. Before farming reached Europe, before the steppe migrations of the Bronze Age, before any of the population movements that would eventually produce the genetic landscape of the modern continent, Europe was home to a group of people scholars call the Western hunter-gatherers. They were not a single tribe or a single culture in any rigid sense. They were a collection of related populations spread across Western and Central Europe, living by hunting and foraging, moving with the seasons, leaving behind bones and tools and, eventually, DNA. That DNA has now been read in considerable detail, and what it shows is a population that carried the blue eye mutation at high frequency. Western hunter-gatherers were, in all likelihood, predominantly blue-eyed. The HERK2 switch had been present in European populations for tens of thousands of years by this point, and it had become common. If you had stood in Western Europe 12,000 years ago and looked at the people around you, blue eyes would not have been unusual. What would have been unusual, strikingly so, is blonde hair, because the same ancient DNA that confirms blue eyes in Western hunter-gatherers tells a different story about hair color entirely. The overwhelming majority of these people had dark hair. Brown, almost certainly, in most cases. The genetic variants associated with blonde hair in modern Europeans are largely absent from Western hunter-gatherer remains. Some researchers allow for the possibility that a very small number carried early versions of the relevant mutations, but if blonde hair existed among Western hunter-gatherers at all, it was vanishingly rare. This is the paradox that the older, pre-DNA models had no real way to address. The population most strongly associated in the popular imagination with the blue-eyed, blonde-haired Northern European type was, in genetic reality, blue-eyed and dark-haired. The combination did not exist yet. One half of it was present and widespread. The other half had not arrived. It was sitting, at that moment in history, on the other side of the continent, carried by people who had never heard of Europe. The genetic variant most responsible for blonde hair in modern Europeans is a mutation in a gene called KITLG. Specifically, a variant designated RS12821256. It does not produce blonde hair on its own with complete certainty. Genetics rarely works that cleanly, but it is the single strongest known contributor to the blonde hair phenotype in European populations today. Hundreds of millions of people carry copies of it, and for a long time, nobody knew exactly where it came from, or how old it was. Ancient DNA answered that question, and the answer was not what most researchers had assumed. The oldest known individual confirmed to carry this blonde allele was not found in Scandinavia, not in Germany, not anywhere in Western or Central Europe. The remains came from a complex of archaeological sites in southern Siberia called Afontova Gora. The individual was a teenage girl, estimated to be around 14 or 15 years old at the time of her death, buried there approximately 17,000 years ago. Her mandible and 5 lower teeth survived. Inside the DNA extracted from those remains was the mutation that, tens of thousands of years later, would show up in the hair of millions of Europeans. This matters enormously for the origin story. Blonde hair, in its traceable genetic form, did not begin in Europe. It began in the population geneticists call ancient North Eurasians, a group centered in Siberia whose descendants would eventually contribute ancestry to populations across a vast geographic range, from the Americas to Europe. The blonde allele was a steppe and Siberian trait before it was ever a European one. The route it took to reach Europe runs through a population known as the Eastern hunter-gatherers. These were people who carried substantial ancient North Eurasian ancestry, and with it, the KITLG variant associated with blonde hair. Studies examining Eastern hunter-gatherer remains from Sweden, Russia, and Ukraine have confirmed the presence of this allele. The blonde hair mutation had crossed into Europe, but the eyes carrying it were mostly brown. The other half of the combination was still missing. The Eastern hunter-gatherers are less familiar to most people than their Western counterparts, but they are just as central to the story. They were a distinct population, genetically separate from the Western hunter-gatherers in ways that reflected tens of thousands of years of divergent history. Where the Western groups had deep roots in Ice Age Europe, the Eastern groups carried a different ancestral signal, one that connected them to the ancient North Eurasians of Siberia, and through them, to populations that had lived through the last glacial maximum in a very different part of the world. That Siberian ancestry is what made them genetically distinctive. It is also what made them the carriers of the blonde allele. The KITLG mutation that had been present in ancient North Eurasian populations for at least 17,000 years traveled west inside Eastern hunter-gatherer biology as these populations expanded and moved. By the time the remains show up in the archaeological and genetic record across Sweden, Russia, and Ukraine, the blonde hair variant is already there, already established, already being passed down through generations. But look at what those same remains show for eye color: brown. Eastern hunter-gatherers carried the blonde allele without the blue eye mutation at anything like the frequency seen in the West. They had the hair without the eyes, The Western groups had the eyes without the hair. The two traits that the modern world packages together as a single Northern European type were sitting in entirely separate populations, divided by geography, by ancestry, by thousands of years of separate history. What neither population could have known was that they were on a collision course. The retreat of the great ice sheets after the last glacial maximum opened new territory, new corridors, new possibilities for movement. Western hunter-gatherers had already expanded northward into Scandinavia from the south following the ice. Eastern hunter-gatherers were moving in from a different direction entirely. The distance between the two halves of the combination was closing. The meeting was coming, and when it arrived, it would produce something that had not existed anywhere on Earth before. The place where the two halves of the combination finally came together was not a single location with a precise coordinate. It was a broad region, a zone of contact that stretched across Scandinavia and down into the Baltic, where the northward push of Western hunter-gatherers and the westward movement of Eastern hunter-gatherers eventually brought them into the same territory. What happened there was not conquest. It was not replacement. It was mixing. Sustained, generational, biological mixing between two populations that had been separated for tens of thousands of years and now found themselves sharing the same forests, the same coastlines, the same world. The genetic evidence for this is unusually clear. Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, as a defined population in the ancient DNA literature, show exactly the ancestry profile you would predict from this encounter. They carry the Western hunter-gatherer signal. They carry the Eastern hunter-gatherer signal. And they carry, for the first time in any population studied so far, both the blue eye mutation and the blonde hair allele at frequencies high enough to produce the combination in significant numbers. This is the founding moment, not a myth, not a metaphor. A traceable biological event, readable in bones dug out of Scandinavian soil. The modern map of blue eyes and blonde hair is not an accident of recent history. It is a direct inheritance from this ancient mixing event. The regions with the highest concentrations today, Scandinavia, Finland, Estonia, the Baltic states, are the same regions where the contact between Eastern and Western groups was most sustained and most consequential thousands of years ago. The geography of the trait reflects the geography of the encounter. Before the final piece of this story, if this combination is in your ancestry, and for many of you watching it is, there is a guide called Where Do You Really Come From? That shows you how to find it in your own DNA results. Link is in the description. But do not go yet. The last part of this video is the most important. The combination existed now. The question was, what would happen to it next? The Bronze Age rewrote the genetic map of Europe. That much is not in dispute. Beginning around 3000 BC, massive migrations out of the Eurasian steppe, associated with a culture archaeologists call the Yamnaya, swept across the continent with a speed and scale that left a permanent signature in European DNA. In some parts of northern and western Europe, steppe ancestry eventually came to account for the majority of the local gene pool. It was one of the most consequential population movements in the history of the continent. For a long time, researchers assumed this was also the moment blonde hair and blue eyes spread across Europe in earnest. The Yamnaya came from the east, the argument went. They carried steppe ancestry, and steppe populations were associated with the blonde allele. It was a reasonable hypothesis. It was also largely wrong. A 2022 study examining Yamnaya remains directly found that these people predominantly had brown eyes and brown hair. The reconstruction that emerges from the genetic evidence is not the fair-haired warrior of popular imagination. The Yamnaya almost certainly carried some copies of the blonde allele, given their ancient North Eurasian ancestry, but they were not a blonde population in any meaningful statistical sense. Their direct contribution to the spread of blonde hair and blue eyes across Europe was more limited than the earlier models had suggested. What is more interesting is what happened in the cultures that descended from Yamnaya admixture with local European populations. The Bell-Beaker culture, which carried steppe ancestry into Britain and Western Europe, showed higher rates of both blue eyes and blonde hair than the Yamnaya themselves. The corded ware culture and the battle axe culture show the same pattern. A 2019 study examining battle axe culture individuals from Sweden, Estonia, and Poland found mixed appearances, with some individuals carrying both traits. The reason is straightforward. These cultures had absorbed local European ancestry, including the hunter-gatherer populations who already carried the combination. The steppe migrations did not introduce blonde hair and blue eyes to Europe. They redistributed and amplified traits that were already there. Knowing where a trait comes from is only part of the question. The other part is why it spread. Mutations appear constantly in human populations. Most vanish within a few generations, lost to chance or outcompeted by more common variants. The fact that blonde hair and blue eyes not only survived but became genuinely common across large parts of Europe requires an explanation beyond ancestry alone. Something was selecting for them, or, at minimum, something was failing to select against them strongly enough to stop their spread. Sexual selection is the explanation most researchers reach for first, and the evidence for it, while not definitive, is suggestive. Blonde hair is today the most commonly chosen color for women dyeing their hair across much of the world. That preference appears to have deep historical roots, showing up in ancient texts and artistic traditions long before the modern cosmetics industry existed. Blue eyes register consistently as attractive across multiple cultures, including cultures where they are rare. If individuals carrying these traits were, on average, more likely to find partners and reproduce in greater numbers, the frequency of the relevant alleles would rise over time without any survival advantage being required. Blue eyes may also have carried a direct adaptive advantage in the specific environments where they became most common. The winters in Scandinavia and the Baltic are long and dark in ways that winters in southern Europe are not. There is a plausible argument that reduced melanin in the iris improves light sensitivity in low light conditions, offering a genuine functional benefit to populations living at high latitudes through months of limited daylight. The selective pressure would have been modest, but modest pressures applied consistently over thousands of years produce measurable results. Then the Vikings arrived. Beginning in the 8th century, Norse populations dispersed across an extraordinary geographic range, reaching Britain, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, and the coastlines of continental Europe. They carried Scandinavian ancestry with them. Iceland, settled almost entirely by Norse migrants, has among the highest frequencies of both traits on Earth today. Britain and Ireland carry a Norse genetic signal that is still detectable 1,000 years later. The Viking expansion did not create the combination, but it exported it, stamping Scandinavian ancestry onto populations far beyond the original mixing zone, and extending the reach of a trait whose origins stretch back to a teenage girl buried in Siberia and a collision of worlds in the ancient north. 2 mutations, 2 ancient populations, tens of thousands of years of separate history. That is what sits behind the combination that gets treated as a single, self-evident European trait. Blue eyes evolved first, possibly as far back as 42,000 years ago, and became common among dark-haired hunter-gatherers in Western Europe long before blonde hair appeared anywhere on the continent. Blonde hair arrived later, carried out of Siberia by Eastern hunter-gatherers who were mostly brown-eyed. The two halves of the combination did not meet until those populations collided in ancient Scandinavia, producing for the first time a population where both traits appeared together in significant numbers. Everything that came after, the Bronze Age migrations, the Bell Beakers, the Vikings, built on that foundation. It redistributed, amplified, and exported a combination that had already been assembled. The Yamnaya did not bring it. The Indo-Europeans did not invent it. It was older than all of them, rooted in a mixing event that happened in the forests of the ancient north before anyone had conceived of farming, bronze, or ships capable of crossing open water. Ancient DNA made it possible to see all of this, not as speculation or linguistic inference, but as a readable biological record extracted from bones and teeth and the accumulated genetic decisions of people who lived and died without any understanding of what they were leaving behind. The blonde hair and blue eyes visible in millions of people across Northern Europe today are not a simple inheritance. They are the biological record of a specific, traceable encounter between populations that had been separated for the entirety of human prehistory, and finally, in one particular region of the ancient world, found each other. The combination was not inevitable. It was not ancient in the way the myths implied. It was the product of a meeting, And the meeting left a mark that is still visible, written into the DNA of everyone who carries it, tens of thousands of years later.